Welcome everyone to our Funding for Trails on Federal Lands webinar. I'm Steph Noll with the Oregon Trails Coalition, and I will be moderating today's session along with sharing some additional opportunities not covered by today's presenters. I want to start by expressing gratitude for our presenters today, some of whom have kind of hopped in on short notice to help us carry this off. And I want to invite all of our attendees to introduce yourself in the chat. All attendees today are on listen only mode, but we welcome you to submit questions at any time in the chat, and we would love for you to choose the everyone option on the chat and let folks know what organization and what area you're joining our webinar from today. We will have some time for our presenters to respond to questions. A lot of what we will be talking about today is kind of some funding that is in progress and changing. So it's not going to be kind of a list of clear-cut grant programs and such today, but more just different kinds of federal funding to start learning about how to better understand and how it will be applied to our trails on federal lands, both now and in the near future. So again, please feel free at any time to share your questions in the chat or Q&A. This webinar is being recorded, and we do expect to make the recording available on the Oregon Trails Coalition blog by sometime this Friday. And I want, again, to express gratitude to all of our presenters. And I'm going to start off by sharing just a few resources available through the Oregon Trails Coalition. So a few resources I just want to point folks to on the Oregon Trails Coalition website, and I'll share these links once our first presenter is speaking. But we have a ready, set, plan guide to trail planning and development that's up on the Oregon Trails Coalition website on our planning page. And in addition to the information in the guide, I just want to share that it has quite an appendix of resource links, all kinds of planning and design and funding resources that you can access there. Also, with gratitude to Jim Shulin of the 40 Mile Loop, we also have a matrix of government funding sources for trails linked to on our website and through that same planning page. So if you're someone who really likes to see kind of all the options out there and be able to kind of sort them by different criteria, that might be a great resource for you spreadsheet lovers out there. I also want to remind folks that our February webinar this year that focused on funding and assistance opportunities for trails more broadly, in particular, a bunch of Oregon State agency funding opportunities is available on our blog. That webinar recording and all the links shared during that presentation can be accessed there. And we'll come back to that point too at the end of this webinar, but some of those funding opportunities through our state agencies are also eligible for projects on federal lands. And lastly, if you're not already on our Oregon Trails Coalition email list, we send out usually a couple of emails a month with different funding and webinar opportunities and other things that are coming up. So keep an eye out on that. We are also learning all the time about how things are changing out there. So as we get new information, we share it with our network. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to our first presenter, Zach Jarrett, to talk about U.S. Forest Service funding.
Oh, hey, thank you, Steph. Just doing a quick audio check and video. Is everything coming through okay?
Yeah, sounds good, Zach. Thanks.
Yeah, excellent. Well, thanks for joining, everybody. Good to spend some time with you all. My name's Zach Jarrett. I am the Regional Trails and Dispersed Recreation Program Manager for the U.S. Forest Service. Thanks for having me. I'm just going to spend a little bit of time this afternoon touching on some of the available funding sources that the Forest Service manages for trail maintenance and trail-related management activities across the region. And then go into a little bit of discussion and dialogue around how folks can get connected to provide kind of feedback and input with your local forest, your local Forest Service districts, and then talk real briefly about some of the different agreement mechanisms that we typically use to partner with folks like you all who help us maintain the vast network of trails that we manage across the region. So just a quick caveat on some of the funding sources that I'm going to cover today. Of course, we are a federal land management agency, and so we are subject to some of our federal appropriations policies and processes that can be somewhat challenging to work through, specifically when we're dealing with situations like we find ourselves in this year, where our fiscal year started on October 1st, but we still don't have a full year of congressionally approved appropriations to operate under. Of course, we've been operating under a series of continuing resolutions, the last of which is set to expire on this Friday, March 11th. And so it's been a bit of a process of fits and starts for the agency. We do have some authority to spend down dollars based on our fiscal year 2021 appropriations, but some of these other pots of money I'm going to talk about today are reliant on a full year appropriations from the federal government. And so until that happens, our ability to kind of leverage those dollars and invest in project work and in supporting the important partnership work that's done is going to be dependent on some of that happening. But just at a real high level, I want to talk a little bit about first our kind of regional trails budget that Forest Service receives annually. And so we get funds from Congress on a yearly basis to provide really that administrative and management support for here in Oregon, around 15,000 miles across the state. Funds are allocated from the Washington office based on a formula that includes a couple of different criteria. The two most important would be, how many total trail miles does a region have to manage? What is the total amount of visitation that those units receive? Those calculations happen looking at the total budget of, I believe, somewhere around 25 million nationally, and that informs the allocation for each one of the regions. And so those funds, once they hit the regional office, are then distributed down to the forests here in the region based on really kind of a similar formula that looks at total trail miles, annual forest level visitations. Those funds are often at the forest and district level used to support our staff's salaries and expenses. That's where we get all of our supplies and materials budgets. And that's also where we leverage some of those dollars to invest in partner organizations through cooperative agreements and other mechanisms of that nature to support some of those kind of ongoing trail maintenance activities. And in the region, I would say that those funding levels do fluctuate annually, just given what our federal appropriations look like. But in average, we can assume that we're going to receive somewhere in the range of about $2.3 to $2.6 million each year, which on the surface sounds like a pretty healthy chunk of money to run a trails program. But when you really start getting into the details around how many miles we have to manage and what those costs look like, it's actually a relatively small amount. So, here in the region, I mentioned in Oregon, we've got 15,000 miles of trail. When you look at the state of Washington as well, we administrate about 24,000 miles. So when you divide that kind of $2.5 million budget against total trail miles, we're left with just a touch over $100 per mile of really kind of our operating budget from Congress. And just for for reference, our typical deferred maintenance cost, where we've got a trail that doesn't meet Forest Service standards, whether it's in a class 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 designation, that average is about $8,000 per mile. So if we're getting 100 and it costs us in many situations on average about $8,000 to maintain that trail. What we're seeing is kind of a backlog of deferred maintenance, a backlog of annual maintenance growing over time. Here in the region, we're sitting on roughly a $38 million backlog between what our deferred maintenance estimates are to get that system back up to standard, and what we have on available funding to fix some of that backlog. But really, as kind of a result of the situation that the Forest Service finds themselves in, we have developed some strategies at the national level. Folks have probably heard of the 10-year Trails Challenge, which looks at increasing capacity to achieve some on-the-ground results with this kind of umbrella of shared stewardship at the forefront. And this region has kind of developed a similar strategy that will tier to and contribute to that national strategy. Really looking at capacity building and looking at leaning on some of our partners in that shared stewardship context to help manage and maintain the network. And I will say with our appropriations, we average about 12,000 miles of trails maintained annually, but over 50% of those miles are maintained through partners and volunteers. So, you know, a huge thanks to those partners and volunteers that are on the call today. We couldn't, you know, do the work that we do without you all lending in and doing your thing wherever you may sit across the state. So just a huge thanks to folks for that. I did want to kind of pivot the conversation a little bit to talk about some of these non-appropriated dollars that we don't get every year. You know, people sometimes refer to those as earmarks, but they're typically programs that have been established through one or several different legislative bills at the national level to provide funding over, you know, anywhere from 1 to 5 years to support trail management, trail maintenance activities. So I just wanted to touch on those briefly for folks so that you're aware of, one, what those are, you're aware of how we make decisions around making investments with those monies, and then how you may be able to plug in with your local units to provide some feedback or some strategic conversations about what those priorities may look like. The first pot of money I wanted to touch on briefly is what's called our Legacy Roads and Trails Remediation Program. This was passed under the President's infrastructure bill. It's a program that has existed in the past, but it sat dormant for the last several years. So with the passage of the infrastructure bill, there's been approximately $250 million allocated to the Forest Service nationally over the next 5 years to invest in this program. And so, you know, the purpose of the Legacy Roads and Trails program, it's really kind of focused on improving water quality and improving water quality by maintaining and repairing a couple of different assets, one of them being roads and the other one being trails, hence the name Legacy Roads and Trails. But that's really kind of an emphasis on, you know, decommissioning closed and unauthorized routes that are delivering physical impacts, sediment delivery to streams, those sorts of things, and or any other actions that can improve aquatic organism passage. So that's just a real fancy way of saying, you know, where we have culverts that exist that are under spec or are failing, this is a program that can make some investments in correcting some of those deficiencies. But really kind of what's important to understand is what will qualify a project to potentially be funded under Legacy Roads and Trails program. And so there's really 8 activities that are identified in the Act that would qualify these projects for funding, some of which I'm just going to kind of touch on briefly because they are specific to National Forest System trails. One of those categories is, you know, will the project effectively decommission previously closed trails that are continuing to receive public use? Another one of the criteria or categories is, you know, will the project work to relocate either a National Forest System road or a trail to increase our resilience to handle extreme weather events, flooding, or other natural disasters, and to really kind of respond to changing resource conditions that we're seeing in real time, which is a pretty broad-based category where if you look at the legacy network that exists for the Forest Service, many of our trails were designed for activities that are not anywhere near kind of the managed use that's happening right now. Another one of the categories that's worth mentioning is, we can propose projects that are converting National Forest System roads to trails. So if you could think about areas where, you've got a road that's no longer being utilized, but that could provide a really important, connection to the existing either motorized or non-motorized trail system, provide a little bit of a better visitor experience to the public. Those sorts of projects will qualify for this funding as well. And then lastly, I'll just mention the final kind of criteria, and that's whether or not the project would be able to increase a National Forest System trail bridge, again, to improve kind of that resiliency around weather events, flooding, and other natural disasters. So, the Trail Bridge Program for Region 6 is the largest trail bridge program in the nation. We've got 1,700 trail bridges that are currently on the landscape. Many of those have been built, outward of 20, 30, 40 years ago. So this is another source of money where we can look at where are those priority bridges, and where do we want to make some investments around sustainability for water quality and things of that sort. Another program that I wanted to touch on real briefly, and I think Steph may provide a little bit of an overview on this later, is the Federal Lands Transportation Program. This is a program that's got some pretty broad-based objectives around repairing transportation infrastructure, reducing some of the bridge structure deficiencies that exist, improving safety, and really from a recreation and trails context, supporting high-use recreation sites that can provide federal economic generation, and then supporting the goals of our agency around how we want to manage for increased visitor experiences. It's a big pot of money that comes down. Right now, if you look at fiscal years 22, which is where we're in, through fiscal year 26, a total of around 130 million over those timeframes are going to be going into the program. And the Washington office actually allocates FLTP funding, again, from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act to the regions based on, again, another formula that's looking at, how many and what are the total number of high-use recreation sites that you have within your region, and then what is recreation visitation, how many miles of what we call are eligible FLTP trails that exist. And they run a process here the Forest Service is engaged in to, again, prioritize projects based on our capacity and our readiness. I'm going to pause for a second and maybe ask Steph to pull up a quick PowerPoint presentation that we've developed to go into a little bit of additional detail around the Great American Outdoors Act, which is an exciting new funding opportunity that came the agency's way starting in fiscal year 21. So thanks, Steph. I'll let you go ahead and advance the slide for me. But just a quick overview for GAOA as we use the acronym here internally. But really, GAOA establishes what's called the National Parks and Public Lands Legacy Restoration Fund. And really the nexus here is that this program is seeking to address deferred maintenance backlogs on the nation's public lands. Y'all heard me get into a little bit of the details around what that deferred maintenance backlog looks like for the Forest Service and our trails specifically in Region 6. But that's not a unique scenario just for this region. Most of the other regions for the Forest Service and most of our other federal land management partners are in a similar situation. But this act did provide to the agency about $285 million annually over the course of the next 5 years. And in addition to the Forest Service, the National Park Service, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the BLM who's with us today, the Bureau of Indian Education, they also receive funds under GAOA. That act also permanently funds the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which is used to secure and purchase public lands for a variety of different things, increased recreation access being one of them. Next slide, please. So how the funding looks is that it's split out across different assets types. So while it is focused on reduction deferred maintenance for trails and recreation sites, it also carves funding out for transportation assets. So 35% of the fund goes to supporting deferred maintenance, reduction on National Forest System roads, bridges, tunnels, culverts, and parking lots. So you think about, the totality of a recreation experience. It's not just, what you're doing when you get to the site and get out on the trail, but it's also around how do we sustainably get the public to these trailheads, these recreation sites, and how do we make some strategic investments in the vast network of National Forest System roads that we manage across the region. But as we get into the non-transportation assets, that's where things are probably pretty interesting for folks on this webinar. We're talking about, deferred maintenance projects at recreation sites, whether those are developed sites, dispersed sites, of our large visitor centers, wastewater systems that have been in place for many of decades that are failing at popular rec sites. And then lastly, trails and trail bridges. The caveat with this, and I kind of started this conversation earlier, is that GAO Act authorizes funding, but that funding must follow our annual appropriations process. So the agency finds ourselves kind of at the whims of Congress again, passing a full year appropriations, because as we work through continuing resolutions, we do not have access to those funds to make investments in fiscal year 22. So that's kind of the bad news. But the good news is that those funds are no year money. So if there's a project that was approved in 2021 and we were only able to do 50% of the work, those funds roll over into the next year, and we have a total of 5 years to pay for those investments. Next slide, please. Again, I kind of touched on this earlier, but the purpose of the fund is to really reduce deferred maintenance. And we define that as an agency in two ways. One is any activity to reduce or eliminate deferred maintenance of an asset, which includes really resolving directly related infrastructure deficiencies that would not by itself be classified as deferred maintenance. So if you can think about a trail that hasn't received annual maintenance for more than 1 or 2 years, that trail could be classified as needing deferred maintenance because we haven't maintained it to standards. So again, this is probably a fund that could be used to pay for some of those trails that haven't been touched for a year or two, but it couldn't be funding just annual, log out and brush out activities, which would be paid for through some of those other pots of money that I've discussed previously. And again, this is consistent. The purpose of this is to be consistent with any other kind of forest or district or regional transportation, deferred maintenance, or capital improvement plan that may have been set up in the past. Next slide, please. So the way the project lists are generated is that there's a pot of money that exists in the Washington office. If you look at that 285 million, 60% of that is retained in the Washington office for a competitive process where the regions identify and submit projects for consideration. 40% of those funds are split to the regions, and we have a little bit more flexibility in the how and where and when those projects move forward. We combine some of those lists. Those lists are generated at the forest level. The region has a set of criteria and sideboards I'll go into here in a second. We prioritize those, rank them, and send them to the Washington office for consideration. I will say that, annually, there is about 20% more projects being submitted than there is available funding. And so not every project that gets identified is funded, but we are whittling away on the high priority work here in the region. And again, future year project lists are typically due in line with the president's budget. So the way our kind of budget cadence works is that the president's actually developing the budget for, let's say, fiscal year 2023 here in the late summer. So we've already submitted project lists for FY21, obviously 22 and 23, but there's a high likelihood that the region will start evaluating proposed projects for fiscal year 24 consideration sometime in the early summer of this year. And I mention that because there is a public outreach component of GAOA. But for folks who think that they have a project that meets some of these criteria that I've explained, you know, it's not too early to reach out to the local district or the forest that you partner with to have some conversations around what does the local process look like for soliciting feedback from partner groups, and how do we want to involve partners with coming up with proposed projects that ultimately you could help deliver some of those outcomes on the ground through cooperative agreements with the agency. Next slide, please. This says FY21 projects, but this is really applicable to every fiscal year. These are just 5 kind of overarching criteria that we make sure is met prior to submitting a project for approval. The most important one at the top, is it ready for implementation? Some of these projects are pretty large in scope and they do require NEPA documents, environmental assessments, things of that nature. So we want to make sure that they're quote unquote shovel ready. And again, since this is an act that's geared towards reduction of deferred maintenance, we need to make sure that deferred maintenance is the primary component of the project. And there's also, I think, additional weight given to kind of that return on investment. So if the project costs 100,000, but it's only reducing deferred maintenance by $10, it's probably not going to compete well nationally. And, you know, inverse, if it's a low cost project, but it's got a great deal of deferred maintenance reduction, it's going to compete better at the national level. Again, is it consistent with plans? Forest Service is really anchored to our forest plan process. So is it consistent with either a forest plan or other forest or district level planning documents that have been created? How does that priority rank at the forest, at the district level, at the regional level? And then again, does it meet some of the national sideboards that, as Steph changes the slide, I'll walk us through real quick. So these are kind of the national sideboards that the Washington office has developed to, you know, act more like criteria as they evaluate proposed projects. Again, this is going to look a little redundant, but does it reduce infrastructure deferred maintenance? Is it promoting management of America's forests? So there is a subset of these funds that can go towards providing for forest management activities, fire, fuels reduction, timber management, things of that nature. A huge emphasis on how does the project contribute to the rural community economic development? Is it going to be an economic generator? Is it a deficiency that's creating a barrier for access in a really high populated or low populated community? How does the project improve visitor experience? You can think about, again, a trail that's got really high social value, but the physical sustainability is really low. You know, can we make some improvements that will provide a better visitor experience for a broad kind of range of motorized and non-motorized users? There's an emphasis on improving visitor access. Some of that can be achieved through, like I said, some of the other auxiliary assets to provide access into some of these areas. Health and safety is a big component, especially for some of our roads that are in a state of disrepair, or trail bridges that are low on their lifespan or ready for potential failure based on bridge inventory work, et cetera. And then lastly, this is where some of our partners come in to the equation. Now, how does this investment leverage additional resources? Some of these projects can be combined with state grants that you all heard from the Oregon Trails Coalition on the state side. Some of them are just leveraging partner contributions, volunteer labor, resources that you all bring to the table. But I think that's the last slide for GAOA. Hopefully it provided a bit of context for folks. And before I kind of turn it over, Steph, I think I got a couple more minutes to touch base on, how and where folks can plug in to potentially partner with the agency around some of these funding opportunities. So for folks on the webinar, this may sound familiar to some of you, and you may have some of these agreement mechanisms in place, but one of the primary ways that we partner with organizations, nonprofit groups across the region is what we call a challenge cost share agreement. And really, challenge cost share agreements are not a contract, but they're an agreement where we identify that there's mutual benefit for our agency, your respective organization, for moving money to accomplish outcomes on the ground. There are requirements for partners to bring at least a 20% match to be able to be eligible for a challenge cost share agreement. And that match can come in the form of, cash match from your organization, but typically what it is some of the match you all bring with volunteer contributions and things of that nature. So that, to me, if I were in your shoes and I was coordinating and communicating with my local forest or district, and some of these funding streams resonated with you, it's worth exploring or having a conversation around what your capacity looks like as an organization. I typically say, the sweet spot for a strategic investment from the agency is where you've got mutual priorities for a project from both the agency and the partner side, where you've got partner capacity to help deliver those outcomes on the ground, and then where the Forest Service has readiness from an implementation standpoint to move out on that project. If you can find alignment in kind of that scenario, I think there's a lot of mutual benefit that we could collaborate on into the future. But again, I just stress the importance of reaching out to your local unit to have those conversations. And then lastly, before I turn it back over, I just wanted to mention a separate funding opportunity that has been the result of a challenge cost share agreement that the Forest Service stood up 2 years ago with our great partners over at Travel Oregon. And that's called the Oregon Trails Fund. So the Forest Service contributes federal funds to our partners, our state partners with Travel Oregon. Travel Oregon brings a match to the table, and we combine those collective resources and we come up with a pot of money that we can strategically invest to trail partner organizations across the state to work on a variety of different trail related activities. The overall goal of the Oregon Trails Fund is, again, to increase capacity and to invest in high priority trail projects across the state, where we're leveraging state and federal resources to accomplish that work. We did make a shift in 2021 to be able to kind of respond to some of the impacts to our partners as a result of COVID. And we made direct investments to the regional destination management organizations across the state who were helping to facilitate a process of small grants that went out to nonprofit organizations to deliver some of those projects on the ground. Myself, our partners over at Travel Oregon, Steph representing kind of the Oregon Trails community, are in the process of trying to figure out what the future of the Oregon Trail Fund looks like, realizing that some of those impacts that resulted from COVID are hopefully behind us for the most part, and how do we want to kind of realign that investment opportunity based on some of the intentions that we had originally as we set it up. So, look for more from Steph, filtered through the Oregon Trails Coalition here probably in the next 6 months around what some of those opportunities may look like. And again, thank you for the time today. Thanks for all you do to help steward your public lands. And I will turn it back over to you, Steph. Thanks.
Thank you, Zach. I just want to, before we go on to our next panelist, give everyone a quick reminder that you are welcome to share your questions in the chat or the Q&A feature, whatever works best for you. And we will kind of bring all of our panelists together at the end to kind of just respond to Q&A generally. We also have some additional smart people kind of waiting in the wings here who aren't presenting today, but are here if there are questions that come up and speak to their areas of expertise. So don't be shy about submitting those questions, and we'll get to what we can at the end of our presentations. And next, I want to welcome Chris Knauf from the Bureau of Land Management, who we're so grateful is here with us today to talk about how things look really different on the BLM side of things. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Stephanie. I'm just trying to, there we go, full screen this. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for being on the webinar today. Let's see if I can center myself on the laptop. I was asked to do this at a late date, and not surprisingly, we are far different than the Forest Service. I love what the Forest Service does. I've been hiking Forest Service trails since the late 1960s, and it's a fantastic investment in pedestrian transportation, especially across forest. The BLM in Oregon has much the same kind of funding that the Forest Service has, and I'll get into some specifics of that. But some of the recommendations I would make for locally advanced trails in either Western or Eastern Oregon is pretty similar to the Forest Service, that as Zach mentioned, talking to your local rec planner contacts and utilizing grants.gov if you haven't been to that site lately. A few things I'd like to touch on today, similar to what Zach touched on, is the infrastructure bill. We are starting to see quite a lot of gains for that, and it will be prioritized. We do not have specific categories yet, mainly because we don't have those buckets set up when the funds came through. But this year will likely be smaller than the forthcoming years. However, we're looking at things like recreation resiliency, which would take larger landscapes and designate trails. One of the things we do lack when you compare us to the Forest Service is a large inventory of designated trails. And that's an important part of the BLM landscape. Just because a trail exists does not mean you can easily maintain it, because if it's not designated, it is A, not in our engineering system, and B, individual NEPA is required. And if you look at the National Environmental Policy Act, even to do maintenance on a trail that is not designated, it's a lot more expensive. So that's what we're shooting for essentially with some of these funds. There are a number of other categories we're likely to see out of the Infrastructure Act. But for the time being, right now, those projects have been prioritized for much what Zach was talking about. Human health and safety comes first. We've had a number of things happen in the past few years. For instance, Loon Lake in the Coos Bay district was pretty well hammered by a windstorm. Most of the infrastructure was impacted in some way. Those kinds of things, along with roads and bridges, are being taken care of immediately. And that also includes water systems at a lot of our sites that need to be refurbished. So those are the kinds of things that are going to be allocated first. And then, once again, I'll mention it again, pay attention to grants.gov, because we are going to definitely have more opportunities coming up. On the side of the Great American Outdoors Act, the BLM in Oregon has currently spent, let me get my numbers here, about $13 million. And that is similar, the projects you find in that act are going to be similar to what I described in human health and safety, roads, bridges, and infrastructure improvements. And for instance, we've seen that with quite a lot of money allocated to the Oregon Trail Center. In fact, that takes quite a lot of my budget allocations every year. The Oregon Trail Center, it's a great place. It does have some trails, but it doesn't necessarily have long distance trails like the Forest Service has. And you'll find that in a number of our sites in Western and Eastern Oregon. Oftentimes our trails are associated with smaller recreation sites where the trails move in a satellite way out from those sites. So in terms of how we maintain trails and our dollars, we get those funds from Congress, like Zach said, and we allocate those dollars to the field. And a lot of times, and what we've seen in the past 3 years or so, is districts are not having a lot of bandwidth to work with. We have the same kind of vacancies that a lot of private industry has, and a lot of folks have moved on and or retired. But that is not a reason not to contact that local office and try and get a trail started. If there are a number of trails I can think of that have been proposed by groups like the Oregon Natural Desert Association, and a lot of groups advocating for long distance trails and trails in general. But as I said before, getting those trails designated and getting some of our older trails maintained remains a priority. And that's really how we differ from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Let's see. So a lot of times when we're looking at getting funds for trails, aside from allocated dollars, believe it or not, the BLM is a pretty big recipient of FLTP dollars, as Zach mentioned, that can cover trails. Also state RTP grants, which come from federal dollars as well. That's money that comes to the states, and the BLM then goes to that pot sometimes and applies for funds to make those trails happen on the ground. And one of the biggest things with those funds is, as Zach mentioned, we need to have, sorry, my dog's jumping on my lap. We need to have a base of labor and volunteership or advocacy to make those projects work. Those assistance agreements, BLM is not that much different from the Forest Service for those. And the more of those we have online, the more likely we are to get those grants or can support another trails group to get those grants. That's something we see a lot. So that's another avenue of funding. But there's really no substitute for advocating for trails on BLM lands and then proposing getting some of the NEPA done, especially if the trails are existing, and then nurturing those trails with some maintenance. So again, I'll mention grants.gov, great place to go. Another thing we do for trails is that are associated with fee sites is that we can dip into those fee dollars, and we have a code for those called 1232, but those dollars can also either directly or sites in more of a more broad area, say a river corridor or a region, things like that. So those are dollars that are also available. So when you do contact a local office or you apply through grants.gov, ensure that you have a base of contact with the district and you have some support for a project. As Zach said, if you can align with the BLM's priorities in that district office, you are much more likely to get that done. Let's switch gears a little bit. Some of the things that we're seeing in the BLM from the Great American Outdoors Act, and places where folks might have been. Stinkwater Pass in Burns is getting quite a lot of development and deferred maintenance. The National Historic Oregon Trail Center is getting quite a lot of funds. In fact, they're closed right now, and it looks like around 2 years to get that deferred maintenance done. I mentioned Loon Lake in the Coos Bay District is getting quite a lot of funds to essentially rebuild some of the infrastructure there. And those are just some examples aside from the bridges and things like that. So when we talk about, access and trails, a lot of what we have in the BLM is setting up that infrastructure to meet demand. So where the Great American Outdoors Act and the Infrastructure Act are really going to help is parking lots, increased capacity on those roads, making sure those bridges are safe for the public. And mostly I'm talking about automobile bridges, not necessarily pedestrian bridges, but pedestrian and mountain bike bridges are certainly going to be in the mix, as well as some of the bridges that connect our National Recreation Trail system. We have, I think, 5 of those in Oregon, including the Rogue and the Umpqua. Those are areas that will likely be recipients of funding at some point in the next 2 years. In terms of our National Scenic Historic Trails, we have 5. Most of those are historic, and although we don't have a great volume of mileage on those trails, we do have the Pacific Crest Trail out of the Medford District and the Pacific Northwest Trail, a little bit of it, out of the Spokane District. And we can expect that, at least on the Pacific Crest Trail, some of those dollars for parking, trailheads, things like that, we'll likely see that in the next 2 years. But as I said, right now, we're really bearing down on those critical elements that need to be repaired before development or expansion of the trail system we have can be implemented. So that's pretty much what I have today. Not as voluminous as what Zach had, but we plan on getting quite a bit done. And I'm seeing a Q&A here. Would you like me to cover that?
We'll go ahead. I'll just wrap it up with a couple more resources, and then we'll move to a general Q&A.
Okay.
So, thanks so much for jumping in and joining us, Chris. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having us.
So Zach briefly touched on the Federal Lands Transportation Program, which supports transportation facilities that federal land managers manage. But I also wanted to flag briefly a program called the Federal Lands Access Program, or FLAP, which is an interesting program that has grants for transportation facilities, including trails that are on, adjacent to, or provide access to federal lands, but for which other agencies are the primary kind of manager or partner or planner or what have you. So it's kind of a specific funding pot, but we've seen this FLAP program funds utilized in Oregon for the historic Columbia River Highway State Trail. And we've seen FLAP utilized for the Oregon Coast Trail planning efforts. So if you're looking at a long range project that is on and off federal lands, if you as a kind of nonprofit or other agency are kind of the responsible planner, you can work with the relevant federal land management agency and local or tribal government on a FLAP grant. And FLAP was just reopened for Oregon after the 21 infrastructure bill. And so it was funny, the last time I looked at the website, there was no new grant process in sight. And now it has been reopened with proposals due April 6th. These are large grants, so the minimum grant size is $100,000. But the funding is eligible for capital improvements, enhancements, surface preservation, safety, transit, planning, and research. So I really encourage folks to learn more about that program if it applies to you. And as a couple of our panelists have referenced, I just want to remind folks that there are a number of funding programs available through our state agencies that are also eligible for projects on federal lands, including, but not necessarily limited to, the Recreational Trails Program, or RTP, the Oregon Conservation and Recreation Fund through Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, and Oregon State Marine Board grants. So if you are interested in more details on those, you can find those grant program links and more information in last month's webinar on our Oregon Trails Coalition blog. I want to thank our presenters. We're going to move into a Q&A right now, and I'm going to share a couple of questions that have come in, and folks are also welcome to folks are also welcome to keep those questions coming. We've got a few more minutes. We can go up to 1:15 to address any of the questions that folks have. Before our first question, I just wanted to share kind of a main takeaway that with these funding sources that are different than grants, I think the number one most important piece is to really partner with the local forest or district or unit around those shared priorities, and that really is the kind of common place to start for most of the funding mechanisms that are being discussed today. But we did have a couple of questions, so if I can invite our panelists, if you want to turn your cameras and mics back on and join us. And the first question has to do specifically with the Oregon Trails Fund, and wondering if it can be applied to personnel costs for kind of a coordinator position, with the acknowledgement that those kinds of coordinator positions are especially hard to fund, kind of are a different beast than kind of direct trail project grants. And I've been involved in these conversations, so I'll start and then pass it to Zach for any other information that he wants to add. But the Oregon Trails Fund currently does not have kind of an open call or cycle. Partners have been discussing kind of what that might look like in the future. So there's not a specific structure to send folks to kind of see current criteria. There's discussions between the Forest Service and Travel Oregon as their partner about kind of what the strategic format for applying those funds in the future could be. But maybe Zach, you can speak a little bit to what your cost share agreement with Travel Oregon does kind of explicitly allow or not.
Yeah, sure, Steph. And it's a great question. And it's something that, we hear quite frequently and are aware of that, and the intention of the OTF is, how can this augment other available funding sources in the state to kind of make up for some of those shortfalls? And so again, Steph and myself and Travel Oregon have been exploring, where is that sweet spot that the OTF could operate in? And I do think that, providing funding for quote unquote sustainable organizational capacity growth is something that we're very interested in trying to figure out. I've seen a tremendous amount of success in pockets around the region where we've had a highly functioning trail collaborative operating, so that again, we can come up with those shared collaborative priorities and make strategic investments. So it's something that, we continue to hear. Again, we're trying to figure out what the future of the OTF looks like. And we've got some sideboards in place with the existing agreement that may or may not make some of those gaps in the funding scenario possible moving forward. Specifically addressing the question about whether or not staff time could be funded, there is nothing in the agreement sideboards that would prevent those funds going out to support some of those activities. But again, it's coming up with kind of a long-term strategy. And we want to hear from folks. I didn't see who asked that question, but we want to create a program for investment that's well supported from trail partner organizations across the state. And so as we start to figure out what sort of opportunities or criteria we're going to establish, there'll be a couple of rounds, I think, of input from organizations to make sure that we're in alignment with what the needs actually are. So, not probably as definitive as you all wanted as an answer, but it's an option, and we realize that there's a need. So we'll explore it further.
Thank you, Zach. We have a question, Chris, about the process for applying to recreation and visitor services grants, like the one that just closed for the Oregon-Washington office, and what groups need to do to get approval from a local district before applying, and kind of if the funding comes from the local district kind of or the state, and so kind of what is the process for kind of advancing grant proposals through that process, especially in light of the bandwidth issues you mentioned of local recreation staff.
Right. So when I was talking about the bandwidth and communicating with those districts, it's important to recognize a couple of things. Priorities have been set in all of our resource management plans. Those are documents that could be 200 pages or they could be 400, but regardless of how big they are, they're going to have a section on recreation and where those priorities are. So the first thing I would do is make sure that you're addressing some of those priorities for trail development. Those are generally going to be dispersed areas or conservation areas we have, such as wilderness or Steens Mountain, for example, and getting those in getting trails designated. So that's the first thing I would do is look at those documents while you're communicating with recreation planners in those districts, so that when you apply for those funds, that application is sent directly either to the district and or me, but usually both of us. For instance, we had a couple for the Oregon Trail Center in Baker City, and then we had calls with the proponent of that grant in one instance because they had questions. That's something that happens too. So that line of communication and advocacy makes a big difference, because it aligns with the priorities the Bureau has set out in a rather public planning process, right? And if it meets those priorities, you're far more likely to be successful to get those funds. Does that answer the question? I saw another one in there about, could you talk about a trail idea all the way through implementation? And that's one I could answer too.
Let's maybe come back to
Okay.
that process question in a minute. I just also wanted to briefly say about I do not find the grants.gov website to be the friendliest website in the world, but the people who answer the grants.gov website helpline are about the friendliest people in the world. So I just want to offer to folks who are trying to navigate that website in the future, don't spend a super big amount of time trying to problem solve on your own. Just call that helpline. Those folks have always been extraordinarily helpful to me when I've done that. And in regards to even just finding the Bureau of Land Management opportunities on that giant government website, just think about both looking for like the Oregon, Washington Bureau of Land Management for search terms, and think about recreation and visitor services as search terms when you're checking back on that website to look for things. So just wanted to offer those quick tips about that beast of a website. I wanted to jump back to Zach real quick. We have a question from Woody about if there's a place where folks can find the information or a draft plan about how the Sustainable Trails Act is getting implemented on the regional level or on the forest and district level.
Yeah, hey Woody, good question. We do, and I'll share this. I'll share this with Steph, and she can get it out to the group as a follow-up document. But I'll share a couple of things. So that Trail Stewardship Act in 2016, it was really actioned through the development of what the agency calls our 10-year Trails Challenge, and that we're kind of in year 3 of the 10-year Trails Challenge, and so that's kind of the Washington office's overarching action plan for addressing some of the elements of the 2016 Trails Stewardship Act. And I think I mentioned this earlier, the region put together a regional trail strategy that adheres to and contributes to the 10-year Trails Challenge. If you think about, 10-year Trails Challenge, we scale down to our regional strategy. There's 4 different elements, and each one of the forests and districts, are implementing it at their own pace based on their individual capacity or lack thereof that they're experiencing. But there's a couple different elements. I think one of the most powerful ones is the identification of a sustainable trail system. And several forests and several, smaller kind of trail zones within forests have been working towards sustainable trails planning, which is going to be kind of the action plan moving into the future around where and how are we going to prioritize collective investments, how are we going to address deficiencies around, trails that need to be developed to accommodate, emerging technologies like side-by-sides, e-mountain bikes, those sorts of things. So it's really on the units to move out at their own pace, but we will share kind of that overarching strategy that has a couple of anchoring elements to the region. But again, you can contact the local forest or district that you're interested in specifically with some of those documents and ask them those specific questions. But I think it'll be helpful to have the context in front of you before those conversations happen. So I'll share it out with Steph.
Great. Thank you, Zach. I wonder if either of you want to kind of tackle a brief overview of just if someone kind of has a trail project in mind, whether that's a new trail or an existing trail that needs a lot of love. kind of just where to start, kind of what's step one, or kind of maybe steps 1 through 3. And while I let you gather your thoughts of if you're willing to kind of tackle kind of what that arc looks like, I also want to give another plug for the Ready, Set, Plan guide on the Oregon Trails Coalition website, which is not an agency specific document, but is kind of talks about the different phases of the kind of trail development process, and has some checklists of kind of what kind of plans to look for to see if your trail shows up in those plans, what kind of people to try to get in touch with, et cetera. So that might be a helpful kind of toolkit for your project, but I'm wondering if Zach or Chris, if you could maybe give a little bit more of an agency specific answer to, like, if someone has a trail project in mind, kind of what are the first few things they should think about doing to get the ball rolling?
Yeah, well, I'll tackle it first and then pass it over to Chris. And I'm glad that you referenced that Ready, Set, Plan document, because it is a really great tool for thinking through, what are the different steps that are going to be involved in taking a project from concept to digging in the dirt. So, make sure you flip through that. I think it does have a lot of really applicable information specific to the Forest Service. But, my personal take is, like anything in life, it starts with a conversation. It starts with some direct dialogue with those district folks who are closest to the ground, who are going to be your partner on working hand in hand on moving a project forward. Some of the questions I think I would start asking during those conversations just are around, what does the capacity look like for you all to move forward on project X in the next 6 months, in the next year? How long would it take to move this forward? I have a conversation specifically about, any potential barriers that may exist in pushing a project forward. I talked a little bit about whether or not a project is shovel ready, but that's an important, I think, anchor conversation to have. Not the scope and scale of every trail project is different. Some are going to require documentation under the National Environmental Policy Act, which honestly could delay a project inevitably as we go through that process. So I'd ask those questions around, capacity, what are the potential barriers? And then how does this project fit in the overall kind of list of priorities that, they're working on at that district level? I think the answer to those 3 questions will give you a really good indicator around the potential success or how expedited a project could move forward. And as a result of those conversations, be thinking about what sort of capacity you or your organization could bring to the table to help work through some of those constraints that may or may not be voiced from that local district representative. But yeah, I think just a couple of tidbits there, but that's where I think I'd start to focus some of the dialogue on.
Chris, do you have any final words on that question?
Yeah, I would echo what Zach said, and I would, if you wanted it in 3 steps, I would say contact this district and look at those alignment of priorities. Number 2 would be, obviously, if it requires National Environmental Policy Act analysis, that's going to go slowly. Understand that, be patient, understand that that's going to take quite a while. I've seen it go anywhere from 1.5 years to 3 years. Sometimes it's a lot easier. But for designating a new trail or a trail that's never been designated, that is somewhat typical, but it can go longer depending on the size of the trail. If I had to say number 3, it would be where local groups can be the most effective is number 3, and that is implementing it after that NEPA is done. We have quite a lot of robust groups in Oregon and Washington where we manage lands that can help build a trail. That's obviously the fun part, right? Building and maintaining a project that you know and love and you enjoy hiking on or whatever mode of transportation it is. So those are really the 3 steps. But yeah, that communication part is incredibly important.
And hey, Steph, maybe one quick extra thought to bring into the virtual room here. Where I've seen successful projects germinate is through, that collaboration that happens locally through trail collaboratives. There's several of them that are working at a pretty high level, where if you can get consensus amongst a group of pretty divergent viewpoints amongst the trail community and come with some really targeted priorities that are bought off and well supported from a broad base of stakeholders, that's worth its weight in gold. That takes the agency, I think, to some extent out of those kind of refereeing positions, if you will, and lets them know that this is a well-supported, well thought out, collaboratively approved process that led to this proposal. That'll go a long ways. And in areas where we don't have functioning trail collaboratives, to our conversation earlier, like, let's all commit to trying to, have some of those in place to ensure that these things move smoothly through the process into the future. So just some thoughts from what I've seen positively across the region.
Great. Well, thank you, Chris and Zach, for joining us today and giving us an overview of the hairy subject that is funding for trails on federal lands. I want to let everyone know that we will post the recording of today's webinar on the Oregon Trails Coalition blog, along with program links that might be helpful. So if you didn't grab things from the chat or someone referenced something, we usually try to do a roundup of links of everything we can provide of what was referenced during the webinar. So we'll send out an email probably this Friday when all of that is available on our blog. We don't have a webinar scheduled at this point for next month, but I want to flag a few things that are upcoming. If you're in Eastern Oregon, we're hosting a meetup in partnership with the Eastern Oregon Visitors Association on March 29th. So keep an eye out on your emails from the Oregon Trails Coalition to join us for that meetup. And we're planning to have some more listening session and kind of work group forum kind of programming coming up later this spring. So there might be a pause on webinar style for formats for some other kinds of coalition conversations coming up, but we'd love to have you participate in those as well. So thanks everyone for joining us today, and especially to our presenters. And I hope everyone has a great rest of their day. Thank you.